Right. Extract number 2 are things that pupils at St Michael's are very bad at. Now, extract number 2 is all about the Catholic threats to Elizabethan England. Now, behind me here, we have the dodgiest woman in history. No, not Miss Adams. It's Mary Queen of Scots. And Mary Queen of Scots becomes a problem when she arrives in England in 1568. Now, she comes basically amidst a bit of a dodgy backdrop. She's been involved in the murder of her husband. She's been booted out of Scotland by Protestant lords. And she comes to England and is basically imprisoned. Now, that then leads to a sequence of Catholic plots to overthrow the Queen, centred around her. First one being the Northern Earls. Now, the Northern Earls involves some Northern Earls. Now, they decide that Elizabeth needs to be replaced with Mary Queen of Scots. So what they do is they plan to use Spanish forces to invade England and get rid of Elizabeth. Now, what they do is they go up north, up to Newcastle, they rip up the English prayer book, or the English Bible, just as sort of like a symbol to say, we don't agree with your religious settlement, blah, blah, blah. However, they're not very organised and they're quite easily put down, and then 800 ordinary Catholics are executed as a consequence. Now, Duke of Norfolk is given a pardon, but ultimately, if we imagine that this is a graph, successful's up there, unsuccessful's down there, the Northern Earls would have to go down there because they are generally fairly useless. Right, now, what happens next in 1570 is the papal or papal bull, which is where the Pope decides that he's no longer happy with Elizabeth and he does something called excommunicate her. He announces that she's a servant of wickedness, and which gives basically any Catholic in England the green light to go against the Queen, and in the eyes of God and the eyes of the Pope, that is absolutely fine. So, threat level I've got right up there. Okay, following on from that, in 1571 is the Ridolfi plot. Now, the Ridolfi plot is led by Roberto Ridolfi, who's an Italian banker living in London. Now, he decides he wants to assassinate the Queen, replace her again with Mary Queen of Scots, again marry her to the Duke of Norfolk, who was also involved with the Northern Earls, and put her on the throne. Now, unfortunately for him, Elizabeth's chief spy, Cecil Walsingham, are involved. They uncover it. There's no direct evidence of her actually being involved, although she probably was. However, unfortunately, the sad part of this is Duke of Norfolk has no chance. Norfolk and chance. And he is finally executed, okay, having attempted to marry her twice, despite her reputation, and failed. So, the Ridolfi plot, I wouldn't say is as important as the papal bull, but it's definitely probably more successful and better organised than the previous one, so it's probably in about the middle somewhere. Okay. Right, now the next one is Edmund Campion. Now, Edmund Campion in 1580, realistically, probably if he'd have been 20 years earlier, wouldn't have been much of a threat to the Queen. But in 1580, amongst the backdrop of lots of these Jesuit priests coming into England, preaching about Catholicism, trying to persuade the 90% of the population that are Catholic to go against Elizabeth. Okay? These people are what we call recusants. Basically, they refuse to accept the religious settlement, they refuse to go to church, refuse to adopt the middle way. He ends up being an unfortunate victim of this and is put to death. Now, these people really, recusants and Jesuit priests, I would put as a fairly high threat level, almost important as a papal bull, mainly because they have access to 90% of the population. They've been to priest training school in Belgium and they've come back and they're spreading ideas amongst ordinary people. And a lot of Elizabeth's reign does really hinge on whether ordinary people like her or not. Okay. Now, the next one's the Throckmorton plot. Now, in 1584, Francis Throckmorton, Ambassador de Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador to Britain, Philip II, and Mary Queen of Scots are all involved in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth and again replace her with Mary Queen of Scots. One familiar theme here, Walsingham foils it, Mary denies that she knows anything about the plot, then de Mendoza gets sent back to Spain. However, there's one thing about this one that probably makes it slightly more of a threat than the previous one, is the fact that they plan to use French, Spanish forces and the Pope's money. So it's a three-pronged attack on Elizabeth. However, it fails. So threat level, probably more important than Godolphin and the Northern Earls, but probably not as much as the Jesuit priest, and probably definitely not as much as the Papal Bull. Okay. Now, our man, our favourite Welshman, and we love Richard Gwyn. Now, Richard Gwyn, threat level to Elizabeth fairly low. However, he's another example of a Jesuit priest who's put to death probably more to do with the date than anything else. Because again, he's a Catholic that's opposing the religious settlement, shaking his chains, refusing to listen to a Protestant church service in 1584, which gets him executed in Wrexham Market, much like an animal. Okay, but we learn about him because again, within the context of the time, 20 years earlier, probably wouldn't have been put to death. But now in 1584, he's being executed because he's a Catholic priest, because he's a recusant, because he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Right. Our final threat is the Babington plot. Now, the Babington plot is probably the most significant of the threats, involving Mary Queen of Scots. Again, he's going to replace Elizabeth. They plan to kill Elizabeth using Spanish forces, and obviously replaced with her. Now, again, familiar theme, this is put down by Walsingham. Walsingham discovers in this case direct evidence linking her to the threat, and he finds that in the form of notes, deciphered coded notes in beer barrels. Walsingham then goes with the evidence to Elizabeth, the evidence to the Privy Council, and wants her put to death. So, Babington plot, probably the most significant, probably the most important in getting rid of this key centrepiece of the threat, Mary Queen of Scots. Right, now, that finally leads us to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, Elizabeth doesn't want to sign, because obviously it's her cousin. And she's a queen, and it's treason to kill a queen. So, in the end, what happens is a member of the Privy Council, Davison, gets Elizabeth to sign a letter, takes it to back to Fotheringhay with Elizabeth's signature, and they execute her in the end. And Elizabeth writes a letter of apology to Mary's son James, apologising for the fact that she's killed his mum. Okay. Now, the death of Mary Queen of Scots signals probably one of the biggest threats to Elizabeth, which is the Spanish Armada, which is put right up there. Now, Philip, one common misconception is that Philip really cares about Mary because she's his friend, all boo-hoo-hoo. Not really anything to do with that. It's to do with the fact that now there is no potential of England becoming a Catholic country. The only way England's going to become a Catholic neighbour to France and Spain is if Elizabeth is dead. So the Spanish Armada is Philip's great big attempt to get rid of Elizabeth in 1588, and probably presents the biggest challenge to Elizabeth's throne. The end.